So there I was the other day, enjoying my dessert disguised as a hot beverage, when I realized that we haven't actually spoken about subqueries. We actually covered common table expressions, but we neglected to touch on subqueries. And that's something that probably is a little bit of a remiss on my side, so let's double back and look at subqueries for SQL. So maybe the best starting place is to cover what is a query. Well, here's an example. If I do a select and I say fingers from a table, which is going to be called hand, where ID is in, so basically if it's one of the following numbers, in which case it's a 3 and an 8. And lo and behold, it returns a certain middle finger. Now, that's an example of a select statement. Pretty straightforward. Now, we've used table expressions before to kind of get multiple selects into a single table at the end. This is something that also a subquery can do, or even better yet, it can give you a reduced amount of results before you get started by selecting something from an existing table to a smaller amount and then allowing you to filter it still further, rather than taking the whole table and filtering it. So let's do an example of this. So if I select the top 10 records where we have name and ID, and then from that we say, okay, where ID is in, but in this case we're using a subquery, so we're going a select ID from hand where fingers, so just as we had before, and this would be a standalone query all by itself, but instead of this time using IDs to separate them, we can say we'll just return us the ID where ID equals middle, and the table name is going to be finger bones. So now we're saying get us the names of those bones where from this different select statement the IDs are. So we now have two tables which are completely separate, but I'm using first query to get me the IDs and the second one to return the name values from those IDs. So I'm effectively joining two tables together using a select statement. Now that's an example, but it's probably not the best example. Alright, so let's do something that normally SQL won't let you do. So if we go ahead and do a select statement and we say, okay, we're going to select name and ID, and instead of calling it ID, we're going to give it an alias, so we'll do as, and we're going to do as finger underscore number. And the result of this is you've now given it a virtual name. Now this is great for results because you can basically name things how you want them to be and how the data is presented. However, it does come with a certain caveat, one of them being that when you try to put a where clause on it, you can only use the original name, which in itself is not a biggie unless your new value is created through multiple values, and then you can't use those values together because the new value is a completely virtual value and don't exist in the original table. So here we've got a virtual name that doesn't exist, so I can't use it. Now, the same could exist for virtual values. I might have said this ID plus 2 equals, and it still wouldn't exist because it's not from the original master table, even though it's a perfectly good number. Now, there's a little cheat around this, so we can say, okay, well, we have our original select statement, and we have our filter still, but instead of filtering inside that first statement, we can say, okay, well, our new one's called T for table, and we're doing a select star from that subclause. We're going to add a little bit of other conditioning information, so we're going to format it just to prove that we can do these things. So I can do case, and from there we can say things like, okay, when this value, which in this case is now T because we've given the table name a T, finger number, and you see we can actually filter on that, and we can say equals 3, then we're going to call that particular one middle. So what we've now done is we've addressed that our subquery will return a virtual value of finger number, and then we can say based on that what we want it to be. or we can select subqueries. We can do all these kind of things. So we can effectively start using those virtual values that otherwise would be unaddressable under normal circumstances. So this is a great way of getting around little bitty problems like this in terms of how do we call these, virtual values, or how do we address them? How do we turn them from just presented information into something that we can query? Because a lot of the times you'll return information and it's too much information, and you want to be able to do a reduced amount of it or filter based on those values. But you can't do that in the first select statement. So using subqueries, you can actually create that first table data with the names, or these virtual values, as you will, and then easily manipulate them. So as an example, if I said ID +1, therefore I'm going to change all the finger IDs. So I'm just going to adjust my query so it includes 4 instead of 3. And you can see these virtual IDs are now addressed, and the naming is correct. And that is an example of how to use subqueries. Now, of course, that's not everything, but that's it for today. Maybe you'll find some more examples.